Guys, let's just be totally honest with ourselves. We took this series for granted. So in this video, I'm gonna retrospect on the underratedly great moments that make this series so good in the first place, while also pointing out the room for improvement, which I believe is part of what caused people to act this way towards the series in the first place. Now, first of all, I'm gonna begin with calling out certain people that have views on the series that I very much disagree with. By the way, I'm not gonna show their name, so don't go attack them. But first of all, this guy on Twitter does not understand what makes the worst Piggy player so great. He did point out that he hasn't actually watched the series in a while and he doesn't remember elements of it, but I genuinely feel like he should have actually watched the series before he made this tweet. There is also a comment from another person, which in my opinion encapsulates the viewpoint that I very much disagree with. And I know it sounds like an understandable point at surface level, because that is kinda what the series basically is for most of its episodes. And I genuinely feel like that is what holds it back from fully utilizing the potential that it has. And I just want to preface that being funny isn't a problem. Most great series have a good balance between serious and a light-hearted tone. But the problem is when you're just completely overlooking the genuine character writing moments. And then there's another comment that I just feel like, sure, it's something that happens in the series, it's there, it's harmless, but you're just focusing on that as if it's the only aspect of the series. I also want to mention that while most of this series is very flawed, with the more light-hearted scenes feeling more lowbrow and meta, making it feel more like a parody, which most of the series definitely does feel like, but those aspects do not get in the way of the moments that I believe genuinely make this series so great in the first place. But look, before I start retrospecting on this series, I want to go over why I'm making this overall point in the first place. I don't believe its underrated strengths or its potential to be even greater deserve to be buried. And that also applies to criticism for what there is to improve. And I make these points because I respect this series for what it immensely does well. Now, I'm gonna go over what makes this series so great in the first place. Now, first of all, even though this doesn't really tie in that much with the other points, I like that the animation and its tone feels unique. Among a lot of Piggy animations that feel like they are inspired from Piggy RP film, this one feels fresh. And that also goes for the player character. Now, tell me, do you find the normal player character in Piggy an interesting character? The player character is like a blank slate that you can put a personality onto when making a Piggy series. But the problem is, a lot of series like Anflix don't really utilize it that much, which to be honest just led to a really boring and bland and uninspired version of the player character. There are others like Lego and Anthony, which are definitely a step above. But I've got to be totally honest with you guys, they pale in comparison to Fudzim's character. Because not only did Fudzim put his own spin on the player character, which is basically what if the player was a cynical, sleep-deprived jerk, and in my opinion, it is way more interesting than any other player protagonist in Piggy generally. Not only that, but his character writing is well developed and fleshed out for a Piggy series. First of all, about Fudzim's powers, I believe they are justified because they tie in to his inner conflicted rage for the infected and those he labels as roaches. Yet despite all the things that push him to being this way, he still has the strength to get back up and do the right thing in the end. And that is truly why Fudzim is the best Piggy player character of all time. And I genuinely believe that despite all the lowbrow slop that has been part of this series, I think the best way to view this series is as a character written story. But I'm not done with the positive aspects yet. I think that another great aspect about this series is the character dynamics that Fudzim has with other characters. And even though these other characters aren't as fleshed out as Fudzim is, I think most of them work well with tying into Fudzim's character story. Bunny embodies the attachment that he has to those he truly cares about, and Georgie embodies what makes Fudzim act the way he does in the first place. He could have let Georgie die, but he had the strength in him to be the better person. And then there is Skelly. Skelly's character, I believe, is the consequential result of Fudzim being selfish, and because of that, it leads to them threatening to take away someone that Fudzim truly cares about. And because of this, it pushes Fudzim to get up and fight for what he cares about, which I also believe are another thing that ties into his powers. But despite defeating Skelly, he still loses his best friend either way. Anyway, as for Mr. P, I think his voice is the funniest aspect of this series, because it sounds like, "This is a replica of Andy's room from Toy Story." But at the end of chapter 12, what Fudzim saw in Mr. P led him to reflect on his own actions, coming to terms with the fact that he neglected those he was trying to protect, and that he senselessly expressed his anger upon those like Georgie. And Mr. P is a reflection of himself that went too far in the wrong direction. Now, moving on from the great aspects that the series already has, I'm now going to go over the very much room to improve that it has, and what I personally think should be done going forward in the series. Now, as of issues the series has, I find the biggest glaring issue that the series has that holds it back is by far the toilet humor. And if there's anything that I would personally just outright remove from the series, I would definitely remove the toilet humor. Another very glaring issue that this series tends to have is that it tends to feel like a parody. More so early on, but I think you should make it feel more like an actual show than a parody, and only use the meta jokes sparingly. And as you've been able to do before, don't let the humor overshadow and ruin the serious moments. And to be honest, for this series, I think the humor generally should come from a light-hearted side for characters' personality, to mainly balance out the tone of the series. Another thing that I feel like should be used much more sparingly is shock value humor, and the humor itself should be less lowbrow. Another thing that I think should be reduced in the series going forward are lowbrow aspects from characters like Doggy. And honestly, Doggy being characterized this way is the reason why I could tolerate Doggy being infected in this series. I also think that going forward, I think the infected should not be talking going forward, because it makes the series feel more like a parody. Anyway, as for the faces, I think you should either keep the classic faces from book 1, or make an animated version of the classic face that he has. Anyway, so since Fudzim develops into a less selfish character by the end, I think during book 2, I don't think that he should ditch what he learned at the end of book 1. Instead, I think it should continue to be developed while focusing the more familiar, flawed aspects of his character on other aspects of his personality, like a good sequel. I also think that in book 2 that secondary characters should be more fleshed out, especially the characters that don't really tie into Fudzim's character development as much. Perhaps Georgie could develop into a more mature character that would be better at standing up for himself, which could lead to Fudzim respecting Georgie more. Speaking of character dynamics between Fudzim and someone else, I think Fudzim and Pony seems like a very obvious dynamic for book 2. Perhaps when Zizzy gets captured and infected, it could help Fudzim and Pony relate to each other more, which I think could form a friendship between the two characters. Anyway, at the very end of chapter 12, it's revealed that Skelly is alive, and part of the Insolence. Now, I am extremely excited to see Skelly return, but I have an idea for Skelly that gives her an even cooler dynamic with Fudsum. So you know how Fudsum has a humane soul? We'll make Skelly heavily contrast with it, with a broken, cold, inhumane soul. What if that could make Skelly a ruthlessly cold and brutal character? Because in book 1, Fudsum broke her soul, which leads to her joining the Insolence. I also have a pretty cool idea that adds to Skelly being a more brutal character. What if she could launch out her chest, open her ribcage, and clamp down on her enemies and kill them, which would be absolutely awesome. Anyway, I feel like I've made my point extremely clear. I hope Fudsum at least hears this out and maybe takes notes, because I genuinely feel like and believe that this series has the potential to be the greatest Piggy series of all time. Anyway guys, what do you think of these aspects of the worst Piggy player? And make sure to like and subscribe, and bye.